It's been years since I waited for someone like you to walk in here. The words were out of Aileen's mouth before she had time to catch them, before she even understood she'd said them out loud. And right at that moment, the screen door slapped shut behind Rodolfo, still dripping from the rain that hammered the street outside in sheets, his faded green pickup parked crooked at the curb, headlights still on under a sky the color of wet slate, because he'd only meant to stop for a burnt-out bulb and a thirst for something cold. He stood in the doorway, rain running off his plaid shirt onto the worn wooden floor, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, a toolbox in one hand and the other hand not knowing where to land. Behind him, through the glass, the storm kept coming down over the flooded road like it had no intention of stopping that night. "Come again," said Rodolfo, water still dripping from his jaw. Aileen felt her face go hot all the way to the roots of her hair. She stood just inside the doorway in her pale blue dress, the fabric already damp at the shoulders from the wind blowing rain in sideways, her long hair soaked and clinging to her collarbone, her arms folded loosely in front of her like she could hold the sentence back after the fact. "Never mind, silly thing to say." She tucked a wet strand of hair behind her ear. "It's just that I've been standing here all morning waiting for a customer, any customer at all. And in you walked, soaked to the bone." She shrugged, but her eyes didn't move off him. "So I guess, in a way, it's been years I've been waiting for someone like you to walk in here. Speaking for the register, I mean." "Speaking for the register," he said, a crooked half-smile pulling at his mouth, though his eyes didn't leave hers either. "Speaking for the register," she repeated, dead serious now, gesturing at the shop with her chin. "Welcome to Miller's Corner. What can I get you?" He looked around the little store properly for the first time, rain still ticking off him onto the boards. 3 narrow aisles crammed so full that the tin roof seemed to sag under the weight of it all. Burlap sacks of feed and grain stacked to the waist, a scarred wooden counter worn smooth at the elbow from years of someone leaning there. And behind the glass door, half swinging on its hinge in the wind, a buzzing red neon sign flickered weakly against the storm, open, stuttering like a heartbeat that kept almost stopping. "Your sign's making a strange noise," Rodolfo said, glancing past her shoulder at it. "Looks like it's about to die out there." "I know. It's been doing that since last year and nobody's fixed it yet. Nobody who knew how, anyway. Electrician." And something about that, deep down, needled at Rodolfo in a way he couldn't quite name, the same way the flooded road outside needled at him, the same way a stranger's kitchen light needles at a man who spent too many nights driving past other people's windows. "Well-stocked little store you've got," he said, mostly just to say something, mostly just to keep her talking. "Smells like fresh coffee," he added, "and cedar too, from the shelves maybe." "I know." Aileen smiled, and some of the nerves eased out of her shoulders. "I don't keep everything sealed up in plastic on purpose. That way it still smells like a real corner store, the old kind. Everything in its place, seems like." She pointed with her chin, careful not to step back from the doorway. "Not yet. Flour and feed on the left in sacks. Bread of the day in the basket by the register. Penny candy in that little jar down there, low enough for kids to reach." "Why so low?" "Because a kid who's happy with a cheap piece of candy grows into a customer for life. That's the math my grandfather always did in his head." She pointed to a small shelf near the door, where a tiny framed photograph of a lighthouse sat beside an unlit candle. "And that's for the ones who travel. I light that candle every morning before anything else, so the road doesn't run dry of customers. And it works, apparently." She glanced at him, at the rain still coming off him in rivulets. "You just walked in, didn't you? In this weather, of all things." "Bulb went out on my porch," Rodolfo said. "And a man learns not to trust a dark porch on a night like this." "Smart man." She finally stepped back to let him properly out of the rain, though he didn't move much past the threshold, like some part of him was still deciding whether he belonged inside at all. "The bulbs are up there." "What wattage?" "The 60s. White light. Not the yellow kind, this white one, looks like a wake. Man of good taste." She dragged the little step stool over with her foot and rose on her toes to reach the box of bulbs, right at the edge of the highest shelf, her wet dress catching the dim light as she stretched. "Wait," Let me get that down for you. I've got it. It's right on the edge. The whole box is gonna fall. It's not gonna fall. I've been climbing down this shelf myself for 3 years. And she brought the box down and stepped off the stool and set the bulb on the counter with a little thud in front of him, rainwater dripping from her hair onto the wood beside it. See? 3 years of practice. Anything else? No. Just that. He paid, counting the coins slowly, one at a time, water still pooling faintly at his boots. You count like it hurts to let go of the money. Been counting everything slow lately. Just got into town this morning. You never know how long a job's gonna last, or how far the money's gonna need to stretch. She handed back the change, one coin so worn it had gone smooth. You new around here? Aline said. It wasn't really a question. New electrician. Contracted out to the Miller farm, fixing the panel on their grain dryer, edge of the highway past the flood line. They'll keep me a few weeks if the weather lets the roads hold. Where are you from? Nowhere really. I show up, fix what's broken, move on before anybody learns my last name. A few weeks, she repeated slowly, like someone tasting a word to see if it stung on the way down. And that was what made Rodolfo really look at her, not just glance, but look. Young, but with the hands of someone who hauled feed sacks alone, and a tired kind of steadiness in her eyes that didn't match the softness of the rest of her face, like she'd learned a long time ago how to stand in a doorway and not flinch at whatever the weather brought her. And why were you standing in the doorway like that? Rodolfo asked, watching the road before I even pulled up. I saw you through the windshield before I saw the shop. Because that's what the doorway's for, Aline said, and something flickered behind her eyes. Quick, like she'd said more than she meant to again. You never know when the good one's finally going to pull in. Thunder rolled somewhere out past the flooded fields, low and long, and for a second neither of them said anything at all. A pair of headlights swept along the far road, slowed near the turn, and kept going, taillights swallowed by the rain. Into the silence that followed walked old Miss Adalgisa, shaking rain off her umbrella at the threshold, leaning hard on her cane, sizing Rodolfo up from his boots to his soaked collar without the slightest ceremony. And who's this girl? She asked, like he wasn't standing right there dripping on the floor. A customer, Miss Adalgisa. One who pays. A good. Let more of those in, than even the wet ones. The old woman set 2 coins on the counter with a dry little click. My bread girl, and put the matches on my tab. I'll settle up, you know how it is around here. I know. Aline pulled the loaf from the basket, wrapped it in brown paper without looking away from Rodolfo for more than a second at a time. And how are the knees tonight in this weather? Like 2 stones dragged through a river. But I keep going as long as the Lord lends me legs and this storm doesn't wash out my porch steps. The old woman took the bread, looked once more at Rodolfo, slow, deliberate, a look that seemed to catalog something, and delivered her verdict on her way back out into the rain. He's a good-looking one, that boy. Don't let this storm wash him away before you get his name, girl. And she was gone, the screen door slapping twice behind her against the wind, rain swallowing the sound of her footsteps almost instantly. Don't mind Miss Adalgisa, she's got an opinion about everything, including strangers who haven't been in the building 5 minutes, said Aline, red to the ears now, wringing a little water from the hem of her sleeve. But welcome, whoever you are. And thank you for coming in, even if it was only for a bulb. Rodolfo laughed, a rusty laugh, a thing he didn't use often, and it seemed to surprise him more than it surprised her. He glanced once more at the flickering sign in the window, then out at the black wall of rain past the door, and didn't move to leave. Storm's not letting up, he said. Might be a while before I can even get that truck back down the road without it sliding into the ditch. Then I suppose, Aline said slowly, watching him with an expression she hadn't quite decided how to wear yet, you'd better stay until it does. Wouldn't want the only decent customer I've had all week drowning in a ditch 200 feet from my door. Neither of them moved toward the register again. Neither of them moved toward the door. And outside, the sign kept flickering. Open, 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 like it, too, was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The rain didn't let up that night. Not for an hour, not for 2, And by the time it finally thinned to a drizzle, Rodolfo had already learned more about the little store than he'd learned about most towns he'd stayed in for a month. He learned that the bread came from a woman 2 miles down who baked at 4 in the morning. He learned that the candle by the door was lit every day at dawn, rain or shine, because Aileen's grandfather had never once let it go dark, not in 30 years. He learned that she counted the register twice, once out loud, once silent, because her grandfather used to say a number spoken and a number felt were two different truths, and you needed to hear both before you trusted either. He didn't leave until the storm had passed entirely and the road had gone from a river back to just wet asphalt, and when he finally did, he stood a moment at the door with his toolbox in hand, looking back at her like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the shape of it. "Thanks for the shelter," he said instead. "Thanks for the company," she said back, and neither of those were quite the right words either, but they do. He came back the next evening for a fuse he didn't need. "Didn't I sell you fuses yesterday?" Aileen asked, not looking up from the crate she was unpacking. "Different amperage. The panel out at the farm's older than I figured." She set a can of beans on the shelf with more care than the can required. "Funny, since you told me yesterday the panel was newer than you figured." Rodolfo opened his mouth, closed it, and reached for his wallet instead of answering. "You don't have to buy something every time," Aileen said, glancing at him now, something soft at the corner of her mouth. "The door doesn't charge admission." "Old habit," he said. "Don't like showing up empty-handed. You showed up with nothing but a busted bulb and a truck full of rain the first night. That's different. That was necessary. And this?" He looked at the fuse in his hand like it might answer for him. "This is also necessary," he said, and she laughed. Really laughed, not the polite kind she gave customers who overpaid and waved off the change, but the kind that came up from somewhere she didn't let out often, and something in Rodolfo's chest loosened at the sound of it, the way a knot loosens when you finally stop pulling against it. He stayed 40 minutes that evening, leaning on the counter with a bottle of root beer, watching her restock shelves she clearly didn't need restocked, listening to her explain which families bought what and why, which houses she extended credit to without being asked, which ones never asked and never needed to. By the time he left, the candle by the door had burned down another inch, and the flickering sign outside had gone from red to a deep, tired maroon in the dusk. The night after that, he came for a roll of wire he already had 2 of in his truck. "You're running out of things to need," Aileen said, arms crossed, though she was already reaching for the drawer where she kept the wire. "Ran out 3 days ago," Rodolfo admitted. "Just didn't want to say so." It was the first true thing either of them had said about the visits, and it sat between them for a second like a held breath. "Then why do you keep coming?" Aileen asked. Her voice had dropped the teasing edge it usually carried. This was a real question, and she wanted a real answer, and some part of her braced for him to dodge it the way men who drift through towns usually dodged questions like that. Rodolfo didn't dodge it. He looked at the shelf of canned peaches like it held the words he needed, and then he looked at her instead. "Because this is the only door in this whole town that feels like it's glad I walked through it," he said. "Every other place I go, I'm the guy fixing the wiring. Here, for about 10 minutes a night, I'm just a guy." Aileen didn't say anything for a moment. She set the wire down on the counter between them, slow, like she was setting down something breakable. "You are just a guy," she said finally quietly. "Around here, at least. Nobody's checking your credentials at the door." "That's the part one like," Rodolfo said, and this time it was his ears that went red, not hers. She rang up the wire she both knew he didn't need, and he paid for it like it was the most important purchase of his life, and when the screen door swung shut behind him that night, it didn't slap the way it usually did. It eased. Like even the door had started being careful with him. Word got around the way word does in small towns. Not through anything either of them said, but through the simple, undeniable arithmetic of a stranger's truck parked outside Miller's Corner every evening at the same hour, rain or shine, whether or not the farm work called for it. "Boy comes in an awful lot for a man just passing through," Miss Adalgisa said one afternoon, setting her coins on the counter with the particular clink she used when she had more to say than a bread purchase required. "He's fixing the Miller Farms panel. Takes time. Takes time to fix a panel. Don't take 3 weeks of evenings drinking root beer at your counter." The old woman fixed her with a look that had outlived several presidents and at least 2 floods. You sweet on him, girl? I'm selling him soda, Miss Adalgisa. That's all. And I'm just here for the bread. The old woman took her loaf and made her slow way to the door, pausing at the threshold to deliver, as always, the last word. Man doesn't drive 2 miles out of his way every evening for a soda he could buy at the gas station on the highway. You'd do well to remember that, girl, before he finishes that job and the reason for the drive dries up. That last part stuck with Aline longer than she wanted it to. She hadn't let herself think about it. The job ending, the panel fixed, the truck gone from the curb the way trucks like his were always eventually gone. She'd built her whole adult life around not letting herself hope for things that had expiration dates stitched into them from the start, because hope like that only ever left a person standing in a doorway watching an empty road. But that evening, when Rodolfo's truck pulled up right on schedule and he came through the door with rain-damp hair even though it hadn't rained, having clearly just showered before coming, she found herself smiling before she could stop it, the same helpless way she'd blurted out that first sentence to him the night they met. You're early, she said. Panels ahead of schedule, he said. Finished the main circuit today. Something cold moved through her at that, quick and unwelcome. Ahead of schedule, how far ahead? 2, maybe 3 days if the weather holds. He said it lightly, like it was good news, like a man reporting he'd be home sooner than expected, and maybe to him it was. That's good, Aline managed. For the Millers. Yeah. He watched her face carefully, the way he'd started watching it over these past 2 weeks, learning the small shifts in it the way he learned wiring diagrams, patiently, thoroughly, like the details mattered because they did. You don't look like it's good. I look however I look. She busied herself with the register, needlessly, the way she'd caught herself doing more and more since he'd started walking through that door. I'm happy for the Millers. Grain dryer running again before harvest. That's important out here. Aline. She looked up despite herself. It was the first time he'd said her name without a joke riding behind it, without softening it into something he could take back. When the panel's done, he said slowly, like each word cost him something to spend, I don't have another job lined up yet. Not around here, anyway. The store went very quiet. Even the sign outside seemed to hold its flicker a beat longer than usual. What are you saying? Aline asked, though some reckless, hopeful part of her already knew, and was already terrified of being wrong about it. I'm saying I don't know what I'm saying yet, Rodolfo admitted, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door soaked to the bone 3 weeks ago, he looked less like a man passing through and more like a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't planned for and didn't know how to name. I just know that for 3 weeks, this has been the only place I've wanted to be at 6 o'clock, and I don't know what to do with that, because wanting to stay somewhere isn't something that's ever happened to me before. Aline's hand found the edge of the counter, gripping it the way she used to grip it during the worst storms, back when the roof leaked and the whole building groaned like it might come apart. Say that again, she whispered. Slower this time. I want to make sure I heard it right. But before either of them could take that next unsteady step toward whatever was waiting on the other side of it, headlights swept across the front window, harsh and unfamiliar, and a car Aline had never seen before pulled to a stop right outside the door, engine idling, someone inside it watching the store like they'd been looking for it for a long time. The engine outside kept idling, headlights cutting a hard white beam through the front window and across the shelves, throwing long shadows of canned goods against the far wall like the store itself had gone still to listen. Aline's hand was still gripping the edge of the counter, her heart caught somewhere between the words Rodolfo hadn't finished and the stranger who had just parked like he owned the ground beneath his tires. You expecting someone? Rodolfo asked quietly, not moving from where he stood. No, Aline said. Nobody comes by this late unless it's an emergency, and emergencies don't usually drive cars that clean. The car door opened. A man stepped out, tall, in a gray suit that looked wrong for the dust and gravel of the lot, an umbrella he didn't bother opening even though a light mist still hung in the air. He walked toward the store unhurried, the way men walk when they've never once in their life worried about being kept waiting, and pushed through the screen door without waiting for it to be held for him. Evening, he said, glancing around the shop the way a man might glance around a room he was already pricing in his head. This the Miller's Corner store? Aline Miller? Depends who's asking, Aline said, and Rodolfo noticed, the way she squared her shoulders, the way her voice dropped its warmth like a coat she'd taken off at the door. Daniel Ashford. He didn't offer a hand. He set a card on the counter instead, sliding it forward with 2 fingers like it was doing her a favor just to touch her wood. Ashford Retail Group. We're doing some land assessment out this way, new development corridor along the highway. I understand this parcel's been in your family a while. 3 generations, Aline said. What's it to Ashford Retail Group? Just gathering information for now. Daniel smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had been practiced in front of enough mirrors to look almost real. We like to know what we're working around. Or working with, depending how conversations go. His eyes moved to Rodolfo, cataloging him the same unhurried way he'd cataloged the shop, then back to Aline. I'll be honest with you, Ms. Miller, a store like this, on a stretch of highway like this, once traffic patterns shift the way we expect them to when the new interchange goes in, a place your size isn't going to see the volume it needs to keep the lights on. Figured it was decent of me to give you fair warning before the surveyors start marking stakes out front. Surveyors, Aline repeated, flat. Preliminary. Nothing's decided. He said it the way men say nothing's decided when everything already has been, somewhere in a room she'd never been invited into. But when the time comes, we do like to make fair offers to the local parcels. Sometimes it's easier for everyone if a family sells before the value drops instead of after. He tapped the card once more, like punctuation. Think it over. I'll be back through in a couple weeks. He left the way he'd come, unhurried, umbrella still closed, the screen door swinging shut behind him without so much as a rattle, because men like that didn't let doors slap at them, not even old screen doors held together with 3-year-old hinges and a grandfather's careful hands. Aline didn't move for a long moment after the car pulled away, its taillights shrinking down the dark highway. She was still looking at the card on the counter like it might rearrange itself into something less true if she stared hard enough. What was that? Rodolfo asked, though he already had a fair guess. That, Aline said quietly, was the sound of every year my grandfather spent building this place getting turned into a line item. She picked up the card, turned it over once, and set it face down, like she couldn't stand the sight of the embossed lettering any longer. New interchange. Traffic patterns. I've heard men like that talk before. They don't come to warn you. They come to soften you up before the second visit, the one where the number's already smaller than it would have been if you'd said yes the first time. You think he's bluffing about the road? I think, Aline said, that it doesn't matter if he's bluffing. All that matters is whether enough other people believe him, because the second folks start thinking this town's about to change, they start shopping like it already has. She let out a breath that shook more than she wanted it to. We survived a highway bypass 12 years ago that nearly killed this place. I was a kid. I remember my grandfather standing right where you're standing, reading a letter just like that card, and not sleeping for a week. And the store made it. The store made it, she agreed, because the town decided it mattered enough to keep making it matter. That's not something you can count on twice. She looked up at him then, and something in her face had shifted, not fear exactly, but a weariness that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier, when they'd been standing in this same spot on the edge of a very different kind of conversation. I'm sorry. You were about to say something. Before the headlights. Rodolfo hesitated. Part of him wanted to pick the thread back up exactly where it had been cut, to finish the sentence about not knowing what to do with wanting to stay somewhere, but the moment had a different weight to it now, heavier, more complicated, tangled up with a stranger's business card and a threat neither of them had asked for. It can wait, he said instead, gently. That can't. He nodded toward the card, face down on the counter like something dead. Tell me about the bypass. 12 years ago. And so she did, leaning against the counter same as always, but slower this time, the words coming out careful, like she was handling something with sharp edges. She told him about the year the highway department rerouted the main road 2 miles east, how half the drive-through traffic that used to stop at Miller's Corner simply stopped existing overnight, How her grandfather had refused every buyout offer that came through that door for 8 straight months while the shelves got thinner and thinner. She told him about the night she found him sitting on the front step at 2 in the morning, not crying, just staring at the dark highway like he could will the customers back onto it through sheer stubbornness. She told him how the town had rallied that time, a benefit dinner at the church hall, a co-op arrangement with 3 neighboring farms that kept the store stocked on credit until traffic found its way back, and how her grandfather had told her afterward, voice rough, that a store wasn't really a business at all. It was a promise a family made to a town, and a town made back, and neither side got to break it just because the road moved. He believed that until the day he died, Aline said. I buried him 3 years ago and I've been trying to keep that promise every day since, mostly alone. Not alone tonight, Rodolfo said, and it came out steadier than he expected, steadier than a man passing through had any right to sound. Aline looked at him for a long moment, like she was deciding whether to let herself believe that, whether 3 weeks of root beer and borrowed excuses added up to something a person could actually lean on when the ground started shifting. You don't even live here, she said, not unkindly, just honest. In a few days your job's done and you're gone to the next town with the next broken panel. I can't build a plan around a man who admits himself he doesn't know what he's saying yet. Then let me figure out what I'm saying, Rodolfo said. He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head up to keep looking at him, close enough that the buzzing red light from the sign outside painted the side of his face in flickers of color. Give me until the panel's finished. 3 days. Let me see this town the way you see it, let me understand what your grandfather understood, and if at the end of 3 days I still want to leave, I'll leave and you'll never have to wonder about me again. But if I don't want to leave, then what? Aline's voice had gone very quiet. Then I guess we'll both have to figure out what a man does when he finds a door he doesn't want to walk out of. The sign outside flickered once, twice, and steadied for a full 3 seconds, longer than it had held steady in over a year, before slipping back into its usual stutter. Neither of them noticed. They were too busy standing there in the small, warm space between the shelves, the business card lying face down and forgotten on the counter, the whole uncertain future of the store balanced somewhere between a stranger's threat and a promise neither of them had fully spoken yet. It was Miss Adalgisa, arriving the next morning before the candle had even finished its first hour of burning, who found the surveyor's stake already driven into the dirt at the edge of the lot, pale, freshly cut wood with a strip of orange tape fluttering off the top of it, planted sometime in the black hours after Daniel Ashford's car had disappeared down the highway. Miss Adalgisa stood over the stake for a long moment before she came inside, and when she finally pushed through the screen door, she didn't bother with her usual greeting. There's a stick in your dirt, girl, she said, cane thumping hard against the floorboards. Orange ribbon on it. Fresh cut, still smells like sap. Aline was behind the counter, counting the morning drawer, and her hands stilled over the coins. How close to the building? Close enough that if that road's coming through the way that man's suit suggested, you'll be able to spit on the pavement from your own front step. The old woman lowered herself onto the stool by the window, the one she always claimed as hers whether or not anyone else needed it. Didn't waste much time, did he? Card in your hand one night, stake in your ground before sunup. That's not how it works, Aline said, though her voice didn't carry much conviction. Land assessment doesn't move that fast. Not for real projects. Maybe it's not about the project moving fast, Miss Adalgisa said. Maybe it's about you moving fast. Man wants you scared before he wants you sold. Scared people sign quicker than convinced ones. She fixed Aline with a look that had watched this town lose 2 other businesses to men with clean cars and unhurried smiles. Where's your electrician this morning? Didn't see his truck out front. He's out at the Miller farm. Finishing the panel. Finishing. The old woman said the word like she was tasting something gone slightly sour. And after that? I don't know, Miss Adalgisa. Aline closed the register drawer harder than she meant to. I genuinely don't know, and I'd appreciate it if the whole town would stop asking me questions I don't have answers to before I've had my coffee. The old woman held up both hands in surrender, but the corner of her mouth twitched with something that wasn't quite an apology. Fair enough. But you ought to pull that stake before more folks see it and start talking themselves into panic. Panic's worse for business than any highway ever was. Aline pulled the stake herself before the morning crowd came through. Dulce, the schoolteacher stopping in for chalk on her way to the schoolhouse, the Reyes boy running in for his father's cigarettes and a soda, Old Man Whitfield shuffling in for his weekly paper even though the paper hadn't printed a weekly edition in 6 years and everyone let him believe it still came. She snapped the stake in half over her knee behind the store where nobody could see, and buried the 2 pieces at the bottom of the trash barrel, like she could bury the whole conversation with Daniel Ashford along with it. It didn't work, of course. By mid-morning, half the town had already heard some version of the story: a man in a suit, a business card, talk of a new highway interchange, and the versions grew wilder with every retelling, the way stories always did in a town small enough that everyone's front porch doubled as a newsroom. By the time Dulce came in for chalk, she'd already heard that Ashford Retail Group was planning to bulldoze half of Main Street. By the time Old Man Whitfield shuffled through for his imaginary weekly paper, he'd heard the whole town was being condemned for a new distribution center. None of that's true, Aline told each of them in turn, patient, tired. It's a corner store on a stretch of highway. Somebody's looking at land. That's all anybody actually knows. But she could see it in their faces, the particular caution people wear when they're deciding whether to keep investing in something that might not be standing in a year. Dulce bought half her usual order of chalk. The Reyes boy's father sent him back the next day not for cigarettes but to ask, carefully, whether Aline thought it was worth settling his tab now, just in case. By the time Rodolfo's truck pulled up that evening, right on time, same as every evening for 3 weeks, Aline was sitting on the front step with her elbows on her knees, staring at the spot where the stake had been like she could still see its shadow in the dirt. Heard about the stake, Rodolfo said, sitting down beside her without asking, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers. Miss Adalgisa flagged me down on the road to tell me. Word travels faster than my truck does around here. It travels faster than sound, Aline said. I broke the thing in half an hour after I found it, and by lunch 3 different people asked me if it was true the whole street was getting condemned. Is it? No. I don't think so. I don't know. She dragged a hand through her hair, frustrated at herself for not knowing, frustrated at Daniel Ashford for making her feel like not knowing was somehow her failure and not his ambush. That's the whole trick of it, isn't it? He doesn't have to actually do anything. He just has to make everybody believe he might, and the fear does the rest of the work for him. Rodolfo was quiet for a moment, turning something over. The panel's done, he said finally. Finished it an hour ago. Millers are running the dryer at full capacity as of tonight. Aline felt her stomach drop, right on schedule, the way it had been dropping every time she let herself think about this moment since the night the headlights swept across the window. So that's it then. Job's done. Job's done, Rodolfo agreed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases like he'd unfolded and refolded it more than once already that day. I made some calls this afternoon. There's a job 2 counties over, a warehouse rewiring, good money, starts Monday. He held the paper out but didn't quite let go of it when she reached for it. And there's this. Aline unfolded it. It wasn't a job offer. It was a hand-drawn map of the town, rough, clearly sketched fast, but careful in its details, with small marks at various points along Main Street and the surrounding roads. She recognized her own store, marked with a little star. She recognized the church hall Miss Adalgisa had mentioned from the bypass story. She recognized half a dozen houses she knew by name, each one marked with initials she didn't immediately understand. What is this? Every electrical panel in this town that's older than the one I just fixed, Rodolfo said. I walked the whole main strip this afternoon while I was waiting on the Millers to test the dryer. Talked to Miss Adalgisa, talked to the Reyes family, talked to your teacher friend about the school's wiring. Half this town's running on panels that are one bad storm away from a real problem. Fire hazard, some of them. Nobody's had the money or the reason to fix it, because nobody who does this work ever stays long enough to notice, let alone care. Aline stared at the map, then at him. You're saying you want to stay and rewire the whole town? I'm saying, Rodolfo said, and his voice had gone careful again, the way it had the night he told her he didn't know what he was saying yet, except now there was less uncertainty in it, more resolve, like 3 days of turning something over had worn it smooth, that a town this size, running on wiring this old, is going to need an electrician a lot longer than 3 weeks. And I'm saying that for the first time since I started doing this work, I found a reason to want the job to last instead of end. He turned to look at her fully now, the flickering red light from the sign catching the side of his face same as it had 3 nights before. I'm not going to the warehouse job Monday, Aline. I already told them no. Rodolfo. Let me finish, because if I stop now I don't think I'll get the rest of it out. He took a breath. That man in the suit is going to come back in 2 weeks like he said, and he's going to make you an offer, and it's going to be smaller than what this place is actually worth to the people who love it, because that's how men like him work. They buy fear at a discount. And I can't fix that with a wrench and a wire stripper. But I can make sure that when he comes back, this whole street is running clean, safe, up to code, looking like a place with a future instead of a place already halfway condemned in everybody's mind. I can give this town one less reason to be scared. And maybe, he hesitated just slightly, maybe I can give you one less reason to face him alone. Aline sat very still, the map trembling faintly in her hands, though there was no wind at all that evening. You'd really stay? For this? For a store that might not exist by fall? I'd stay, Rodolfo said, because I've spent my whole life being the man who fixes what's broken and leaves before anyone can need him for anything more than that. And 3 weeks ago I walked through a door in the rain and met someone who needed exactly that, and somehow it turned into something I didn't know I was capable of wanting. His hand found hers, careful, like he was testing whether she'd let him. I'm not asking you to promise me anything, Aline. I'm asking you to let me stay and find out what this could be, alongside whatever's coming for the store. Both fights, together. That's all. The screen door creaked open behind them before she could answer, and Miss Adalgisa's voice cut through the quiet evening with all the subtlety of a foghorn. Well, don't just sit there holding hands like teenagers at a church social, the old woman said, arms crossed, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. Come inside, the both of you. There's people gathering at the church hall tonight. Word spread about the stake, and half the town wants to know what's really going on before Ashford comes back and tells them himself. And Aline, she paused at the door, cane tapping once against the frame, they're going to want to hear it from you. Not from some stranger with a business card. From you. Aline looked down at the hand-drawn map still in her lap, at Rodolfo's hand still holding hers, at the red sign flickering steady behind them for one long, unbroken moment before stuttering again, and for the first time since the headlights had swept across her window 3 nights ago, she felt something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope, but sat somewhere dangerously close to both. Let's go hear what they have to say, she said, standing, pulling him up with her. But Rodolfo, if you're staying, you should probably know what you're staying for. It's more than a store. It's a whole town's worth of people who are about to ask you to prove you meant what you just said. The church hall smelled like it always did on gathering nights, burnt coffee, old hymnals, and the particular mustiness of a building that had stood through more floods and funerals than anyone still living could count. By the time Aline and Rodolfo pushed through the double doors, most of the folding chairs were already filled, and the low murmur of 24 overlapping conversations died down into something quieter, more expectant, the moment people noticed who'd walked in. There she is, someone said from the back, not unkindly. Aline felt Rodolfo's hand at the small of her back, steady, not pushing, just present, as she made her way toward the front where Miss Adalgisa had already claimed 2 chairs and was guarding them with her cane laid across the seats like a drawbridge. Pastor Whitcomb stood near the pulpit, though this wasn't really church business and he knew it, hands folded in the particular way he had when he was trying to look neutral about something everyone in the room had already picked a side on. Folks, he said, once Aline had settled into her chair, I think we all know why we're here. There's been talk since this morning about a stake in Aileen's lot and a man from some retail group asking around about the highway corridor. I figured it was better we hear the truth of it from Aline herself than keep passing rumors back and forth over fence posts. All eyes turned to her. Aline felt her throat tighten, the same way it used to tighten when her grandfather would ask her to mind the register alone for the first time, when she was young enough that the responsibility felt like a coat 2 sizes too big. She stood anyway. A man named Daniel Ashford came by the store 2 nights ago, she said, and was grateful her voice came out steadier than she felt. Said he's with a retail group looking at land along the highway corridor for a new development tied to a possible interchange. Said he wanted to give us, fair warning before surveyors started marking the area. Left a card. Said he'd be back in 2 weeks with an offer. An offer for what? Called out Frank Reyes from the second row, arms crossed over his chest. Your land or all of ours? I don't know yet, Frank. He didn't say. That's the truth of it. He didn't say much of anything specific. Just enough to make sure everybody started worrying. She let that sit a moment. And I think that's the point. I don't think he needs to actually buy anything to win. I think he just needs enough of us scared enough, long enough, that half the street closes up on its own before he ever has to write a single check. A ripple went through the room, not quite panic, but something close to its cousin, worry dressed up as practicality. Dulce, the schoolteacher, raised a hand halfway, then just spoke instead, the way teachers do when they've spent years not waiting to be called on. My sister's husband works for the county planning office 2 towns over, she said. I called her this afternoon after I heard. She checked the public filings. There's no approved interchange project anywhere near here. Nothing on the books. Not even a proposal, just a preliminary land use inquiry filed by Ashford Retail Group requesting information on parcel values along this stretch. The room went quiet in a different way now, the quiet of people recalculating. So he doesn't have a project, Old Man Whitfield said slowly, working it through out loud the way he worked through most things. He's got a maybe, and he's dressing it up like a certain. That's what I think, Aline said. And I think if enough of us start selling out of fear of a road that might not even exist, we'll have built the very thing we were scared of, except now it'll be his to build on instead of ours to keep. Frank Reyes shifted in his seat, not quite convinced. That's easy to say when it's not your family's tab 3 months behind at the feed store, Aline. Some of us don't have the luxury of waiting to see if a maybe turns into a definitely. If a real offer comes and it's decent money, some of us are going to have to take it, project or no project. I know that, Frank. Aline's voice softened but didn't waver. I'm not asking anybody to turn down money they need. I'm asking everybody to at least make that choice with the truth in front of them, instead of a stranger's manufactured panic. That's all any of us can ask of each other. It was Rodolfo who spoke next, rising from his chair beside her, and the room's attention shifted to him with the particular curiosity small towns reserve for newcomers who suddenly have something to say. Most of you know me as the fella who's been fixing the Miller's grain dryer, he said. Some of you might have noticed my truck's been parked outside Miller's corner a lot more than a grain dryer job requires. A small ripple of laughter moved through the room, easing some of the tension, and Aline felt her ears go warm despite everything. I walked most of Main Street this week. Talked to a fair number of you about your wiring, since that's my trade. And I'll tell you plainly, a good chunk of the buildings on the street are running on panels and wiring that are decades past their safe lifespan. That's not a scare tactic, that's just fact, the kind you can check with any inspector willing to drive out here. And what's that got to do with some Suits business card? Frank asked. Because a street that looks tired, that looks like it's one bad storm away from a real problem, is a street that looks ready to be bought, Rodolfo said. Men like Ashford don't just read traffic patterns. They read how a place looks when they drive through it. Whether it looks cared for, or whether it looks like it's already given up. He glanced at Aline, just briefly, before continuing. I'm not leaving when my contract with the Millers ends. I'm staying, and I'm going to spend the next while bringing this whole street up to code, house by house, shop by shop, for whatever anybody can afford to pay me, which in some cases is going to be nothing at all, because that's not really the point. The point is that when that man comes back in 2 weeks, I want him driving down a street that doesn't look scared. I want him looking at a town that looks like it plans on being here in 20 years, because it will be. The room was quiet for a different reason now, the particular quiet of people deciding whether to believe a stranger, weighing his 3 weeks against their whole lives here. It was Miss Adalgisa who broke it, thumping her cane once against the floor for emphasis. I've lived on this street 61 years, she said, And I remember the bypass scare same as half of you do. I remember standing in this very hall while Diocleo Miller, Eileen's grandfather, for those of you too young to remember him proper, told us a store wasn't a business, it was a promise a family made to a town and a town made back. Well, I'm old enough now to say plainly what I think. This town kept its half of that promise once already, and I don't intend to be the generation that lets some man in a clean car convince us to break it now over a maybe. She looked around the room, daring anyone to argue. Whoever wants to help this young man fix up Main Street proper, meet at the hardware co-op Saturday morning. Whoever wants to sell out from under a scare that isn't even real yet, that's your business and I won't judge you for needing to feed your family. But don't let it be said nobody gave you the truth first. A murmur of agreement moved through the room, not universal, not entirely settled, but real, the sound of a town deciding, chair by chair, which side of something it wanted to stand on. The meeting broke up slowly after that, the way these things always did, clusters of conversation forming and reforming near the coffee urn, near the door, in the parking lot under a sky that had finally, fully cleared of the storm from 3 nights before. Eileen stood near the front for a long while, accepting handshakes and quiet promises and a few skeptical nods that weren't quite agreement but weren't quite refusal either. It was Frank Reyes who found her last, near the door, his cap in his hands the way men held them when they had something harder to say than what they'd said in the meeting. Your grandfather fronted me the money for my truck's transmission 8 years ago, he said quietly. Never asked me to sign anything. Just said I'd pay him back when I could, and I did, eventually. I haven't forgotten that, Eileen, even if I sounded like I was arguing against you in there. He put his cap back on, awkward. I'll be at the co-op Saturday. Figured you should know that before you go home tonight wondering who's really in your corner. Eileen watched him go, throat tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time, and turned to find Rodolfo waiting by the door, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the look of a man cataloging every small thing about her the way he cataloged wiring, patient and thorough, because the details mattered. You didn't have to do that, she said, walking toward him. Stand up in front of the whole town and promise them free labor you can't really afford to give. I didn't do it for the town, Rodolfo said. Not only anyway. He held the door for her, and the two of them stepped out into a night gone clear and cool, stars visible for the first time in days over the dark fields. I did it because I meant what I said 3 nights ago, about not wanting to be the man who leaves before anyone can need him for anything more than fixing what's broken. Turns out proving that takes more than words. Figured I'd better start proving it in front of witnesses, so I couldn't talk myself out of it later. They walked back toward the store in comfortable silence, past dark porches and quiet yards, and it wasn't until they were almost at Miller's Corner, the neon sign visible even from 2 blocks away, still flickering its stubborn red open into the night, that Eileen stopped walking altogether. Rodolfo! He turned back to her, and something in her face made him go still. Saturday. The co-op meeting. If half this town shows up ready to fix wiring for free labor and good faith, and Ashford comes back in 2 weeks to a street that's cleaned up its act, he's not going to just walk away quietly. Men like that don't lose gracefully. He's going to come back with something worse than a business card. What makes you think that? Because, Eileen said, and for the first time since the headlights had swept across her window, real fear moved plainly across her face. My grandfather told me once that during the bypass fight, before the town rallied, before any of the good things happened, someone burned down the feed co-op storage barn in the middle of the night. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody was ever even really investigated. It just happened, right when the town started fighting back instead of giving in quietly. She looked past him, down the dark street toward her own flickering sign, suddenly looking very small against the night. I need you to understand what we might actually be starting here, before Saturday. Because if I'm right about what kind of man Ashford really is, this isn't just going to be a fight about wiring and business cards anymore. Saturday morning came up gray and cool, the kind of morning that smelled like the last true breath of summer before autumn started asking questions of it, and by 7 o'clock the gravel lot beside the hardware co-op was already crowded with more trucks than Eileen had seen parked in one place since the county fair. She hadn't expected this many people. She'd hoped, quietly, the way you hope for things you're too afraid to say out loud in case saying them jinxes it. But hope and expectation were different animals, and standing at the edge of the lot with a thermos of coffee going cold in her hands, watching Frank Reyes unload spools of wire from his truck bed alongside 3 of his cousins, watching Dulce arrive with a clipboard and a look of fierce organizational purpose, watching even old man Whitfield show up with a folding chair and determination to supervise from a safe distance, something in Aileen's chest loosened that had been clenched tight for longer than she wanted to admit. Rodolfo moved through the crowd with a rolled set of hand-drawn diagrams under one arm, directing small clusters of volunteers toward different buildings along Main Street, patient in a way that surprised even Aileen, who'd started to think she understood the shape of his patience after 3 weeks of watching him fix what was broken without complaint. "You didn't tell me you were planning a small army," she said, catching him between conversations. "I didn't plan it," Rodolfo said. "I asked 6 people if they wanted to learn to check a panel for fire risk. Word spread the rest of the way on its own. That's how towns work, apparently, something I'm still learning." "That's how this town works," Aileen corrected gently. "Not every town rallies like this." "No," he agreed, watching Frank's cousins haul a coil of conduit toward the old feed store 2 doors down. "I'm starting to understand that too." By midday, 3 buildings along Main Street had fresh panels installed, cheap enough that Rodolfo had negotiated bulk pricing from a supplier 2 counties over, a favor called in from a job he'd done there years back. Dulce's schoolhouse got its wiring inspected and flagged for a proper overhaul the following week. Even Miss Adalgise's little house at the end of the block, the one she'd lived in alone since her husband passed a decade ago, got a full afternoon's worth of attention, the old woman sitting on her porch the whole time offering commentary nobody had asked for and sweet tea nobody refused. It was near 4 o'clock, with the light going long and gold across the fields, that the second car pulled up outside Miller's Corner, not Daniel Ashford's clean sedan this time, but something older, more familiar, and Aileen felt her stomach drop for an entirely different reason when she recognized the woman stepping out of it. "Mama," she said, setting down the crate of nails she'd been carrying toward the store. Her mother stood by the car door for a moment, taking in the sight of the street, the ladders, the extension cords running between buildings, the small crowd of neighbors working in loose, cheerful clusters up and down Main Street, before her eyes found Aileen and softened into something complicated. "I got a call from your Aunt Rosa," her mother said, crossing the gravel lot slowly. "Said there was some man threatening to buy up the whole street, and that you'd organized half the town into a work crew like your grandfather used to. Thought I'd better see it with my own eyes." Aileen hadn't seen her mother in over a year, not since the last brief, strained visit 2 Christmases back, the kind of visit that left both of them relieved when it ended, though neither would ever say so out loud. Her mother had left for the city when Aileen was 17, chasing a job and then a marriage and then a life that never once circled back through this particular stretch of highway except for holidays that grew further apart each year. "I'm handling it, Mama." "I can see that." Her mother's gaze moved past her, toward Rodolfo, who was crouched by an open panel box with Frank Reyes, explaining something with his hands the way he always did when the words alone weren't quite enough. "Who's that?" "Rodolfo. He's an electrician. He's been..." Aileen hesitated, unsure how to compress 3 weeks into a sentence her mother could hold on to. "He's been helping." "Helping?" Her mother's eyebrow lifted, the particular expression she'd worn Aileen's whole childhood whenever she suspected there was more to a story than the story being offered. "Your Aunt Rosa mentioned that too, actually. Said the whole town's talking about how often his truck's parked outside your store." "The whole town talks about everything, Mama. That's not news." Her mother was quiet for a moment, watching the street, watching her daughter's face in a way that made Aileen feel exactly 17 again, standing in this same lot the year everything had changed. "I never wanted this for you," her mother said finally, quietly, and there was no cruelty in it, just old, worn grief finally finding a place to land. "This store. This street. I watched your grandfather pour everything he had into it and I watched it slowly take pieces of him he never got back, and when he got sick I thought, I hoped, you'd sell it, finish school, come live near me, build something that wasn't tied to a building that could burn down or flood or get bought out from under you by some man in a suit whenever the world decided it was time." She looked at Aline fully now, eyes bright in a way she was clearly fighting. Instead, I come back after all this time and find you standing in the middle of exactly the fight I spent years trying to keep you out of. I know you didn't want this for me, Aline said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than the last time they'd had this conversation, years ago, in a much angrier kitchen. But it's what I wanted, Mama. Grandpa didn't trap me here. I chose to stay, and I choose it again every single morning when I light that candle by the door, and I'm not going to apologize for it anymore, not even to you. Her mother's eyes moved past her again, back toward the street, toward the small determined chaos of neighbors fixing each other's wiring on a Saturday afternoon for no pay beyond the promise of being helped in return someday. Something in her face shifted, some old resistance finally cracking under the weight of what she was actually seeing instead of what she'd imagined all these years from a distance. He would have loved this, her mother said quietly, almost to herself. Your grandfather. This is exactly the kind of afternoon he used to talk about at supper when the bypass thing happened. He never stopped talking about it, you know, right up until he passed. Said it was the proudest he ever was of this town, watching it choose itself over the easy way out. You could stay, Aline offered, tentative, the offer feeling strange and fragile in her mouth after so many years of not making it. See it through. Meet Rodolfo properly, not just as a rumor from Aunt Rosa. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them that hadn't passed between them in years. Not quite forgiveness, not quite reconciliation, but the first loose thread of something that could, with enough careful handling, become either. I've got a week before I need to be back, her mother said finally. I suppose I could spend a few days of it here. See what all the fuss is about. A small, reluctant smile touched her mouth. And meet this electrician properly, since apparently he's important enough that half the county already has opinions about him. It was as her mother was settling into a folding chair beside Miss Adalgisa, the two of them already, within minutes, deep in the particular gossip-trading truce that women of a certain generation seemed to negotiate instantly, that Aline noticed the sedan. It was parked at the far end of Main Street, engine off this time, no headlights, no unhurried approach. Just Daniel Ashford, sitting behind the wheel, watching the entire scene unfold through his windshield with an expression Aline couldn't read from this distance but felt, somehow, all the way down to her stomach. He didn't get out. He didn't drive off either. He simply sat there, watching the street full of neighbors fixing wiring, watching the little crowd of people who'd chosen, loudly and visibly, not to be afraid of him, and after nearly a full minute of stillness, he finally started the engine and pulled away, slow, deliberate, in no particular hurry, the way a man leaves when he's recalculating rather than retreating. Rodolfo had seen it too. He crossed the street to where Aline stood, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag, following her gaze down the now empty stretch of road. He saw everything, Aline said quietly. Good, Rodolfo said. Let him see it. Let him drive back to whatever office he came from and explain to whoever he answers to that this street doesn't scare as easy as he was counting on. You don't understand, Aline said, and there was something new in her voice now, something that hadn't been there this morning when the lot was full of trucks and hope and gold afternoon light. That's not relief on his face when he drove off just now. Men like that don't get discouraged when a plan doesn't work the easy way. They just start planning the hard way instead. She turned to look at Rodolfo fully, and behind him, up and down the street, she could see the fruits of the whole day's work. New panels, fresh wiring, a town that looked, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like it believed in its own future. I think we just showed him exactly how much this town is worth fighting for. And I don't think a man like that walks away from something worth fighting for. I think he just changes his strategy. That night, long after the volunteers had gone home and her mother had settled into the small guest room above the store that hadn't been used in years, Aline sat on the front step with Rodolfo. The candle by the door burned down to its last stubborn inch of wax, and neither of them said much of anything at all, until, far off down the highway, headlights appeared again, moving slow, moving deliberate, and this time they didn't stop at the store at all. They simply passed by, slow enough to be seen, slow enough to be a message, and disappeared into the dark toward the edge of town where the old feed co-op storage barn had stood for 60 years, The same barn Aileen's grandfather had once watched burn to the ground in the middle of another fight just like this one. Neither of them slept much that night. Aileen lay awake in her room above the store, listening to the old building settle and creak the way it always did after midnight, listening for something else too. An engine, a match, anything that might mean the headlights that had passed by so slowly weren't just a coincidence of someone lost on a dark road. Rodolfo had wanted to stay the night in his truck outside, keeping watch, and she'd told him no, not because she didn't want him there, but because some stubborn part of her refused to let fear reorganize her life before it had actually done anything to earn that power. By the time the sky started going gray at the edges, she gave up on sleep entirely and went down to open the store the way she did every morning. Light the candle, count the drawer, unlock the door before the sun properly cleared the tree line, and found Rodolfo already sitting on the front step, a thermos of coffee beside him, his truck parked exactly where it had been the night before. "You didn't go home," she said, though it wasn't really a question. "Went and came back," he admitted. "Drove past the old feed co-op around 2 in the morning. Wanted to make sure the headlights didn't mean what we were both afraid they meant." And? Barn still standing. Nothing disturbed as far as I could tell in the dark. Might have just been someone taking the long way home. He didn't sound like he believed that, and she didn't either, but they both let the possibility sit there anyway, because the alternative was harder to hold on to that early in the morning with the candle barely lit. Her mother came down an hour later, still unused to the creak of the stairs, still moving through the store like a woman visiting a museum of her own abandoned childhood, touching the edge of the counter, running a hand along the same worn groove her father's elbow had carved into the wood decades ago, standing a long moment in front of the little shelf with the lighthouse photograph and the candle before she said anything at all. "He never stopped lighting this thing," she said quietly. "I used to think it was silly. A candle for the road. Like the road could see it." "Maybe it's not really for the road," Aileen said. "Maybe it's for us. So we remember to look." Her mother turned, studying her daughter's face in the thin morning light, and something passed between them again, that same fragile thread from the day before, still holding, a little stronger now for having survived the night. The rest of that week moved fast in the particular way weeks move when a whole town has decided, collectively and without quite saying so out loud, that it's holding its breath for something. The wiring work continued, building by building, though with less of Saturday's festive energy and more of a grim, determined steadiness, like people digging in for a fight they now understood was real. Frank Reyes started parking his truck across the mouth of the co-op's gravel drive every night, an unofficial watchman nobody had asked him to be. Miss Adalgisa took to sitting on her porch later than usual, cane across her lap, watching the road with the particular vigilance of a woman who had outlived enough trouble to recognize its shape before it fully arrived. Aileen's mother stayed longer than her promised week, first explaining it as needing to see the wiring finished, then as needing to see how the Ashford situation resolved, then, by the second week, simply not offering an explanation at all, settling into the rhythm of the store like something that had been dormant in her, not dead, finally waking back up. She took to running the register on slow afternoons, chatting with customers she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades, most of whom greeted her with a warmth that seemed to surprise her more than anyone. "They remember you," Aileen told her one evening, watching her mother laugh at something old man Whitfield said, easy and unguarded in a way Aileen hadn't seen from her in years. "I didn't think they would," her mother admitted. "I left. People don't usually forgive leaving so easily." "This town's better at forgiving than you'd think," Aileen said. "Ask Rodolfo. 3 weeks ago he was a stranger nobody trusted with a screwdriver. Now half the street calls him by name." It was on a Thursday evening, 12 days after the sedan had first pulled up outside Miller's Corner, that Daniel Ashford returned, not with headlights sweeping dramatically across the window this time, but on foot, walking up from a car parked a respectful distance away, briefcase in hand, his unhurried smile back in place like it had never left. "Ms. Miller," he said, stepping through the door Aileen had propped open to catch the evening breeze. "You've been busy." "I drove the length of Main Street on my way in." "Quite the transformation." "Community effort," Aileen said, not moving from behind the counter. "Turns out people fight harder for something when they understand what they're actually being asked to give up." "Admirable." Ashford set his briefcase on the counter, unlatched it with the same unhurried care he did everything, and withdrew a folder thick with paper. Which is exactly why I think you'll find this offer more generous than you might expect, given the circumstances. He slid the folder across the counter. Aline didn't open it. There's no interchange project, is there? She said. Nothing filed. Nothing approved. Dulce's sister checked the county records 2 weeks ago. There's nothing there but a preliminary inquiry with your company's name on it. Something flickered across Ashford's face, not quite surprise, more like mild professional respect for a hand played better than he'd expected. You've done your homework. You bet on a scared town, Mr. Ashford. This one didn't stay scared long enough. No, he agreed, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door 2 weeks ago, his voice lost some of its practiced smoothness. It didn't. That's unusual in my experience. Most towns this size, this far off the interstate, don't have the resources to organize the way this one did. I'll admit, I underestimated something. He glanced past her, toward the window, toward the street beyond it. But you should know, Ms. Miller, that just because there's no interchange project filed today doesn't mean there won't be one filed tomorrow, or next year, or the year after. Land like this close to a growing corridor, doesn't stay unnoticed forever. I might be the first man to walk through that door with a folder like this. I promise you I won't be the last, and the next one might not give you 2 weeks of warning and a chance to organize your neighbors. Maybe not, Aline said. But we'll be ready. We know how to do this now. You taught us that actually in a strange way. Thank you for that at least. Ashford studied her for a long moment, something almost like genuine curiosity in his expression, the look of a man recalculating a person rather than a property. Then he closed his briefcase, unopened folder and all, and picked it back up off the counter. For what it's worth, he said, pausing at the door, the Barnes story. The one about the co-op from years back. I heard about it too, secondhand, back when I was researching this parcel. I want you to know that's not how my company operates, whatever you might have assumed about those headlights the other night. I don't do business that way, and I'd have fired anyone on my team who did. He adjusted his collar, something almost sheepish in the gesture. For what it's worth, the car that passed through here that night wasn't mine. I was 2 counties over that whole evening, closing a different deal. I don't know whose headlights you saw, but they weren't mine, and I'd think twice before assuming every shadow that crosses this town belongs to me. He left without waiting for a response, the door easing shut behind him the same careful, unhurried way it always did with him, and Aline stood very still behind the counter, turning his last words over, feeling the ground shift slightly beneath a fear she'd built an entire narrative around for nearly 2 weeks. If it wasn't him, she said slowly, when Rodolfo came through the door minutes later, having watched the whole exchange from across the street, then who was in that car? Neither of them had an answer. And it was Miss Adalgisa, arriving moments later with her cane thumping fast against the boards, face pale in a way Aline had never once seen on the old woman in all her years behind that counter, who finally gave them one. Frank Reyes just radioed up from the co-op, she said, breathless. Somebody's truck just drove off from behind the storage barn, no lights, moving fast toward the county road. And there's smoke coming up from the loading dock, girl. Real smoke. You'd best come now, both of you, and bring whatever water you can carry. The smoke was already visible from 3 blocks away by the time Aline and Rodolfo reached Main Street's edge, a thin gray column rising against the darkening sky behind the old feed co-op, and Aline felt the last 12 days collapse into a single point of raw, animal fear as she ran toward it, Rodolfo half a step behind her, both of them abandoning the truck the moment they saw how many other people were already converging on foot from every direction. Frank Reyes was already there, a garden hose stretched taut from his own outdoor spigot 2 properties over, spraying water in a thin, inadequate arc at the base of the loading dock where flames had caught in a pile of discarded pallets and dry brush someone had let accumulate against the barn's old wood siding for longer than anyone should have allowed. Wasn't the whole barn, Frank shouted over the crackle and hiss of water hitting fire, his shirt soaked through with sweat and effort. Whoever it was, they piled brush against the loading dock and lit it there. If I hadn't been sitting watch. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. More neighbors arrived by the minute. Buckets, more hoses, Miss Adalgisa directing traffic from her porch with her cane like a woman conducting an orchestra, Dulce's husband arriving with the volunteer fire department's portable pump normally reserved for the county fair's dunk tank, someone's teenage son running relay with buckets from the Miller's stock pond 2 properties down. It took nearly 40 minutes, but the fire never reached the main structure of the barn at all. Caught early, drowned young, the whole blaze reduced finally to a smoking, blackened scar against the loading dock's old wood, ugly but contained, a wound instead of a death. Aline stood in the wreckage afterward, stood on her hands, her mother's arm tight around her shoulders. Her mother had run the whole distance from the store without stopping to think twice, something Aline noted through her exhaustion and filed away to examine later, when there was room in her chest for anything but relief, and stared at the scorched with the same way she remembered her grandfather once describing staring at another fire, another loading dock, another night just like this one. 12 years and a lifetime ago. It's the same, she said quietly, to no one in particular. Exactly the same as the story he used to tell. Except this time, Miss Adalgisa said, arriving at her side, cane sinking slightly into the churned, muddy ground, the barn's still standing girl. Because this time, somebody was watching. Because this time, this town didn't wait to be scared before it started protecting what's its own. The sheriff arrived an hour later, a heavy-set, unhurried man named Purcell who Aline had known her whole life, who'd bought penny candy from that very jar as a boy and now drove the whole county in a single cruiser that had seen better decades, and took statements slowly, methodically, flashlight sweeping across the tire tracks still visible in the soft dirt behind the barn where a vehicle had clearly idled before pulling away fast. Truck tires, Purcell said, crouching over the tracks, frowning. Not a sedan. Whoever it was drove something with real tread on it. Farm truck, work truck, something like that. Ashford drives a sedan, Rodolfo said. We already ruled him out. He was 2 counties over closing another deal, apparently, the whole evening. Convenient alibi, Purcell said, though he didn't sound entirely skeptical, more like a man cataloging possibilities out loud. But if it checks out, then we're looking for somebody local or somebody driving something that blends in around here. That's a smaller net to throw, but it's also a lot closer to home, which some of you might not much like the sound of. Nobody liked the sound of it. The implication sat heavy over the small crowd still gathered near the smoking dock. The idea that whoever had done this wasn't some faceless corporate agent from 2 counties over, but someone who knew this road, knew this town, knew exactly which nights to choose and which trucks wouldn't draw a second glance. It was Frank Reyes, of all people, standing there with his soaked shirt and his garden hose still coiled loosely in one hand, who finally said the thing nobody else wanted to say first. There's a man been buying up parcels quiet-like for the last year, over past the county line, he said slowly. Name's Garrett Boone. Local fella, not some big city retail group. Bought the old Hutchins place, bought the Delacroix spread, been sniffing around anybody with land near the highway corridor for a while now, long before this Ashford business ever showed up. Man's been trying to assemble a big enough parcel to sell to a developer for a serious profit. My cousin does some fencing work for him, mentioned it to me a few months back, didn't think much of it at the time. You're saying this could be him, Aline said. Not Ashford at all. Some local land speculator who saw an opportunity when a stranger's business cards started scaring people, and figured he'd push things along himself. I'm saying it's worth Purcell driving out that way and asking a few questions, Frank said carefully. That's all I'm saying for certain. But it'd explain a truck instead of a sedan. It'd explain somebody who knew exactly which nights this street would be least watched, before we started keeping better eyes on things. Sheriff Purcell straightened slowly, tucking his flashlight back into his belt, expression unreadable in the dim light. I'll drive out and have a conversation with Mr. Boone in the morning. Can't promise it'll lead anywhere. Talking to a man isn't the same as proving anything, and I've got no warrant and no witness, just tire tracks that could belong to half the trucks in this county. He looked around at the small, soot-streaked crowd still gathered in the dark. But I'll tell you what I told your grandfather 12 years back, Aline, when that other fire happened and we never did find who set it. A town that watches out for itself the way this one just did tonight doesn't stay an easy target for long. Whoever's behind it. Whoever set this fire was hoping to scare you all back into hiding. Instead I count near 30 people standing here at 9 o'clock at night, soaked and covered in soot, refusing to let a barn burn down without a fight. That's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing. The crowd dispersed slowly after that, exhaustion and adrenaline finally giving way to the simple, bone-deep need for sleep, and Aline found herself walking back toward the store flanked by her mother on one side and Rodolfo on the other, none of them saying much, all of them still carrying the smell of smoke in their clothes and hair. It was her mother who broke the silence first. Once they were nearly back at the store, the flickering red sign visible ahead of them in the dark like a small, stubborn beacon. I used to think leaving was the brave thing, she said quietly. Getting out before the store could take anything else from this family. I told myself for years that staying was just a slower way of losing. She glanced sideways at Aline, something raw and unguarded in her face that Aline hadn't seen from her mother since she was a very small child. I watched you tonight, running toward a fire instead of away from it, and I understood for the first time that I had it backward the whole time. You're not the one who got trapped here, Aline. I'm the one who ran from something worth staying for. Aline didn't trust her voice enough to answer that properly. Not yet, not with smoke still thick in the back of her throat and adrenaline still humming under her skin. She reached over instead and took her mother's hand, the way she used to as a very small girl crossing this same stretch of road, and the three of them walked the rest of the way to the store in a silence that felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, less like the silence before a storm and more like the quiet that comes after one has finally passed. They found the note the next morning, tucked under the store's front step, weighted down with a stone, the handwriting rough and unsigned. You should have sold when he offered. Next time won't be a warning shot. Aline read the note twice before she let herself say anything, standing on the front step in the thin early light with her mother's hand still gripping her shoulder from behind, the stone that had weighted it down still sitting where it had rolled when she'd bent to pick it up. Next time, she repeated quietly. So this was supposed to be a warning. Give it here, Rodolfo said, and she handed it over without argument, watching him turn the paper carefully by its edges, the way he'd seen Sheriff Purcell handle evidence the night before, though none of them had any real idea what they were doing beyond trying not to smudge whatever might still be readable on it. Sheriff Purcell arrived within the hour, called out from his morning coffee by Rodolfo's phone call, and studied the note with the same slow, unhurried thoroughness he'd brought to the tire tracks the previous night. Plain paper, ballpoint pen, block letters so we can't match it to handwriting, he said, mostly to himself. Somebody thought this through at least a little. That's not panic. That's a message somebody wanted delivered clean. He looked up at Aline. I drove out to Garrett Boone's place first thing this morning, before your call came in. Wanted to get ahead of the day. And? Aline's mother asked, arms crossed tight over her chest, standing close enough to her daughter that their shoulders nearly touched. And he wasn't home. Truck was gone. Neighbors said he left before sunup, which a man's within his rights to do, but it's an interesting morning to choose for an early start, given the circumstances. Purcell folded the note carefully into a plastic bag he produced from his jacket pocket. I'll keep looking. I want to be honest with you both, though, a note like this, unsigned, no real threat specific enough to charge anybody with even if I did have a name attached to it, that's a hard thing to build a case around. What I can tell you is that whoever wrote it wants you scared enough to stop organizing, stop fixing wiring, stop standing in a crowded lot on a Saturday looking like a town that isn't for sale. That tells me something at least. It tells me you're winning, whatever fight this actually is. People don't threaten folks who are already losing. It was cold comfort, but Aline found she could hold on to it anyway, turning Purcell's words over in her mind for the rest of that long, strange day, a day spent with half the store's regular customers stopping by not to buy anything but simply to stand a moment at the counter, to ask if she was all right, to leave without quite saying what they meant but meaning it all the same. Business, strangely, picked up rather than slowed. Word of the fire and the note had spread the way word always spread in this town, but instead of scaring people away the way Aline had feared it might, it seemed to draw them closer, like the whole street had collectively decided that whoever was trying to frighten Miller's Corner into folding would have to contend with a town that showed up louder, not quieter, in response. Dulce brought her whole third-grade class by on a field trip that had nothing to do with any actual curriculum, just 20 kids crowding into the narrow aisles buying penny candy while their teacher chatted with Aline at the register about nothing in particular, the visit itself the point rather than any lesson attached to it. Old man Whitfield started showing up twice a day instead of once, claiming each time some new excuse about a paper that still didn't exist, staying longer each visit like he was standing guard without admitting that's what he was doing. Even Frank Reyes's whole extended family rotated through in shifts, buying more than they needed, leaving larger tips in the little jar by the register than the transactions required, a whole town quietly redistributing its love into the shape of commerce because that was the only language the store had ever really spoken. It was near closing time, the sky gone that particular deep orange that came right before true dark, when Rodolfo found Aline alone behind the counter, counting the drawer with hands that had gone steady again after a full day of trembling just beneath the surface. "I called the warehouse job," he said. "The one 2 counties over, the one I turned down when I decided to stay." Something cold moved through Aline's stomach. "And?" "Told them I appreciated the offer but I was staying put. For good this time. Not just until the wiring's finished." He came around the counter, close enough that she had to look up at him the way she had that very first rainy night, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. "I know the timing looks strange. Fires and threatening notes aren't usually what convinces a sane man to plant roots somewhere. But I've been doing the math wrong my whole life, Aline. I always thought the safe thing was staying ready to leave, never getting attached enough that leaving could hurt. Turns out the actual safe thing, the thing that actually holds a person steady, is having somewhere worth staying for, even when, especially when, staying gets hard." "You're choosing now," Aline said slowly, "to plant roots in a town where somebody just tried to burn down a barn and left a threat under my doorstep." "I'm choosing now," Rodolfo agreed, "because that's exactly when it matters most. Anybody can love a place when it's easy. I want to be the kind of man who loves it when it's not." He reached out, brushed a strand of hair back from her face the way he'd wanted to do for weeks and never quite let himself. "I told you once I didn't know what I was saying yet. I don't know. I'm saying I want to stay and I want to build something here, the store, this street, whatever comes next for both of us, and I want to do it in the daylight, in front of the whole town, so nobody ever has to wonder again whether I mean it." Aline felt her eyes sting, exhaustion and fear and something warmer, steadier, finally catching up with her all at once. "You know this isn't over. Whoever left that note, whoever set that fire, they're not going to just stop because you gave up a job in another county." "I know," Rodolfo said quietly. "That's not why I'm staying. I'm staying because I'd rather face whatever's coming standing next to you than safe somewhere else, wondering how it turned out." He paused, something almost shy crossing his face despite everything. "Also because I already told Miss Adalgisa this morning, and if I backed out now she'd have my hide with that cane before I made it out of town." Aline laughed despite herself, a real laugh, the first one that had felt entirely unguarded in days, and something in the tightness of the last 2 weeks eased, just slightly, just enough to breathe around. It was Frank Reyes who came running the half-mile from the co-op just as they were closing the shutters that evening, breathless, his face carrying an expression that made Aline's stomach drop all over again before he'd even said a word. Purcell caught him. Frank managed between gulps of air. "Garrett Boone." Sheriff pulled him over on the county road not 20 minutes ago, out past the old grain elevator, truck bed still full of gas cans and kindling. Man was headed toward the Miller's property this time. Purcell figures he was planning to hit the grain dryer next, the one your electrician just finished fixing, figuring maybe if he couldn't scare the town off the highway corridor, he'd start hurting the businesses that depend on this street instead. Aline felt her knees go momentarily weak, relief and fresh horror tangling together in her chest at the thought of how close the night might have come to a very different ending. "Is he talking?" Rodolfo asked. "Did he say who he's working with, if anyone? Whether Ashford's company had any part in any of this?" "Purcell says Boone's already singing like a canary, trying to cut himself a deal," Frank said. "Says it was all him, no connection to Ashford Retail Group at all. Apparently Boone saw an opportunity when Ashford's inquiry got folks scared, figured he could push the panic further himself, buy up whatever parcels folded first, then flipped the whole assembled stretch to Ashford's company or some other developer for a fat profit once things had settled. The fire, the note, all him, trying to speed up a process that wasn't moving fast enough for his liking once the street started fighting back instead of folding. The relief that moved through Aline then was so total it nearly buckled her knees for real this time, and she felt Rodolfo's arm come around her without either of them quite deciding it should, steadying her the way he'd been steadying pieces of this town, one wire and one wall at a time, since the night he'd first walked through that door soaked from the rain. "It's over," she said, testing the words like she didn't quite trust them yet. "It's actually over." "The fire and the threats, maybe," Rodolfo said gently. "But Aline, Ashford's still out there. His company still might come back one day with a real project, a real offer, project or no project this time around. This town might have won tonight's fight, but the bigger one, the one about what the street is worth to a corporation looking at land instead of lives, that one's not over. It's just been paused." Aline looked past him, down the darkening length of Main Street, at the new panels gleaming faintly under porch lights up and down the block, at the fresh wiring that had turned a scattered, worried collection of shops into something that looked, for the first time in years, deliberately and stubbornly alive, and found, to her own surprise, that the thought of a future fight didn't frighten her the way it would have a month ago. "Let it come then," she said. "Whatever's next. We'll be ready for it." This town just proved that, tonight, in the worst possible way. She looked up at Rodolfo, at the steady, patient warmth that had walked through her door on a rainy night and simply never quite left since. "But for tonight, I think we've earned one evening where nothing else is coming. Just us. Just the store. Just the sign, doing what it's supposed to do." Above them, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the neon sign held its light without a single flicker, steady, unbroken, red against the deepening dark, as if it, too, had finally decided it had something worth staying lit for. The days that followed Garrett Boone's arrest settled into something Aline hadn't felt in years. Not quite peace exactly, but the particular, hard-won quiet that comes after a storm has genuinely passed rather than merely paused. Sheriff Purcell confirmed within the week that Boone had been formally charged with arson and criminal mischief, that his hastily assembled land deals across the county line were already unraveling under scrutiny, and that Daniel Ashford's company, once informed of the whole affair, had sent a brief, formal letter distancing Ashford Retail Group from any of it entirely, along with, to everyone's genuine surprise, a small check made out to the church hall's general fund, an unofficial apology for whatever role their inquiry had played in setting the whole ugly chain of events in motion. "Conscience money," Miss Adalgiza pronounced, examining the check Pastor Whitcomb had brought by the store to show Aline, holding it at arm's length like it might be contagious. "Won't stop men like that from trying again somewhere else, some other town that doesn't fight back the way we did. But I suppose it's something." "It's something," Aline agreed, and found she meant it without bitterness, a lightness in the agreement that surprised her. The wiring work continued through that stretch of easy, golden September afternoons, though with less urgency now, more the unhurried rhythm of people doing good work because it needed doing rather than because a threat hung over not doing it. Rodolfo took on 2 apprentices from town, the Reyes boy, who'd shown a genuine aptitude for it during the Saturday work party, and surprisingly, Dulce's husband, who confessed he'd always wanted a trade to fall back on beyond his accounting work and had simply never had a reason to learn one until now. Aline's mother stayed through the whole ordeal and then, once it had settled, simply kept staying, in a way none of them discussed directly but all of them understood. She took over the store's bookkeeping, a task Aline had always handled alone and badly, freeing up hours Aline hadn't realized she'd been missing until she had them back. In the evenings, she and Miss Adalgiza had taken to sitting together on the front step trading decades of gossip they'd both somehow retained despite the 20-year gap in their direct acquaintance, and more than once Aline caught her mother laughing in a way that seemed to reach all the way back to some younger, less guarded version of herself, a version Aline had only ever seen in old photographs. It was on one such evening, the candle by the door burning steady in its little dish, the neon sign holding its light without a flicker for the 4th night running, that Aline's mother found her alone in the back room, sorting through a box of old ledgers that had belonged to her grandfather. "I found something," her mother said, holding out a worn, leather-bound notebook Aline didn't recognize. It was tucked behind the ledgers, further back than I've ever gone looking. I think it was his. Your grandfather's, not store business. Something else. Aline took the notebook carefully, opened it to a random page, and felt her breath catch at the sight of her grandfather's familiar, cramped handwriting, dated some 30 years back, long before she'd even been born. Stores slow again this month, the entry read. Wonder some nights if I'm a fool for holding on to it the way I do. Then a stranger walks through that door soaked from a storm, buys a bulb he didn't really need, stays talking 2 hours, and I remember all over again why a place like this matters more than the numbers in the register ever could. It's never really been about what we sell. It's about who walks through and who stays to talk once they're inside. Aline read the entry 3 times before she trusted herself to speak. He wrote about a stranger, she said quietly. Soaked from a storm. Stayed to talk for hours. She looked up at her mother, something uncanny moving through her chest. That's almost exactly how Rodolfo and I know, her mother said softly. I read it before I brought it to you. I think, in his own way, your grandfather was writing about something he half hoped would happen again someday, long after he was gone. Maybe he even wrote it hoping you'd find it exactly when you needed to. She sat down beside Aline on the old wooden crate, the two of them shoulder to shoulder over the notebook the way Aline imagined her grandfather might have once sat with someone, decades ago, telling stories that hadn't yet finished happening. I used to think this store only knew how to take things from our family. Reading this, I think maybe I had that wrong too. I think it's been quietly giving things back the whole time, in its own slow way. We just weren't always in a place to notice. They sat together a long while after that, reading more entries, some ordinary, records of good months and bad, small kindnesses extended to neighbors who'd needed them, a whole secret history of the town written in one careful, private hand, until the evening had gone properly dark outside and the store's front bell chimed with the particular rhythm Aline had come, without quite realizing it, to recognize as Rodolfo's. She found him in the front room, toolbox set down by the door out of long habit, though there was nothing left urgent enough to warrant carrying it, standing beside the little shelf with the lighthouse photograph, looking at the candle burning steady in its dish. Found something you should see, he said, and there was an odd, careful energy in his voice that made Aline set the notebook aside and come closer. He held out a small, flat velvet box, the kind that made her heart do something complicated and immediate before he'd even opened it. Before you say anything, he said quickly, I'm not doing this the way it looks like I'm doing this. Not yet anyway. I'm not asking tonight. I wanted you to see it, and I wanted to tell you why, before I decide when the right night actually is. He opened the box, revealing a simple, worn gold band, clearly old, clearly not purchased new from any store. It was my grandmother's. Only thing of hers I've carried with me my whole life, town to town, job to job, 12 years of never once taking it out of the bottom of my toolbox because I never had a reason to think I'd need it. I want you to know it's here. I want you to know what it means that I'm finally taking it out of that box after 12 years of it staying hidden at the bottom. He closed the box gently, held it in his palm like something almost too precious to be trusted to open air. I'm not asking you to answer anything tonight, Aline. I'm just asking you to know, clearly and without any doubt, exactly where this is headed, so that whenever the night finally comes, it isn't a surprise to either of us. Just a certainty, finally spoken out loud. Aline stood very still, the notebook full of her grandfather's careful handwriting still sitting open on the crate behind her, the candle burning steady by the door, the neon sign holding its light unbroken in the window for the 4th night running, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that had been unsettled, restless, quietly searching for exactly this shape for longer than she'd let herself admit. I already know where it's headed, she said softly. I think I've known since the first night you stood dripping in that doorway and I said something I didn't mean to say out loud. I just didn't let myself believe it could actually get here. Well, Rodolfo said, a slow smile breaking across his face, I suppose we've got some time now to let ourselves believe it properly. No fires to put out. No men in suits threatening the street. He gestured vaguely at the quiet store around them, the candle, the steady sign, the whole ordinary, hard-won piece of an evening with nothing urgent left to survive. Just this. Just us, finally getting to have this part. It was 2 days later, on a bright, ordinary Tuesday morning that gave no warning at all of what it would become, that the letter arrived, plain envelope, county courthouse return address, addressed to Aline Miller in official, typed lettering that made her stomach drop the instant she saw it sitting among the store's regular mail, because letters that looked like that never, in her experience, contained good news. Her hands weren't quite steady as she opened it, standing behind the counter with the morning light coming warm through the front window, her mother pausing mid-sentence across the room, sensing the shift in the air before Aline had even fully unfolded the page. She read it once, fast, uncomprehending. Then again, slower, letting the words actually land. "Aline," her mother said carefully. "What is it?" "It's a notice." Aline's voice came out strange, distant, like she was hearing herself from the far end of a long hallway. "A tax reassessment. The county's redone the property valuations for the whole corridor, says here it's tied to increased development interest in the area over the past several months." She looked up, and the fear in her face had a different shape than it had 2 weeks ago, quieter, more clinical, the fear of numbers rather than fire. The assessed value on this lot just went up almost 3 times what it was last year, which means the tax bill's about to do the same thing. Her mother crossed the room fast, taking the letter, scanning it herself with the particular sharpness she'd apparently kept sharp all these years despite the distance she'd put between herself and this store. This can't be right. A jump like that, this fast, based on what? A few land inquiries that never even turned into actual projects. "It doesn't matter if it's right," Aline said, and she could hear the old, familiar exhaustion creeping back into her own voice, the specific tiredness of a fight she'd thought, just 2 days ago, might finally be behind her. "It matters what the number says, and the number says I owe more than 4 times what I've ever owed on this place in a single year, due in 90 days, or the county starts proceedings against the property." She set the letter down on the counter, hands flat beside it, steadying herself against the wood the way she had so many times before, through so many different kinds of trouble. Ashford didn't need to buy this place at all, did he? He just needed to make this corridor look valuable enough on paper that the county did his work for him. "You don't know that," her mother said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced of her own reassurance. "I don't need to know it for certain," Aline said quietly. "I just need to know that it doesn't matter whether he meant to or not. The result's the same either way. A tax bill I can't pay, on a schedule that doesn't care about barns or fires or whether this whole street just proved how much it's worth fighting for. This isn't a fight you win with a work party and a garden hose, Mama. This is a fight you win with money I don't have." Rodolfo arrived 20 minutes later, having heard from Frank Reyes, who'd heard from the postmaster, who apparently had noticed the county seal on the envelope and put 2 and 2 together faster than Aline had managed to open it herself. He read the letter in silence, his jaw working the particular way it did when he was working through a problem that didn't have an obvious wiring diagram to follow. 90 days, he said finally. That's not nothing. That's time to organize something. Organize what, exactly? Aline's voice had an edge to it now, not aimed at him but not entirely controlled either, the frayed edge of someone who'd spent a month fighting fires, some of them literal, and found, just when she'd thought she could finally exhale, an entirely new and different kind of threat waiting behind the last one. You can't rewire a tax bill, Rodolfo. You can't out-volunteer the county assessor's office. This isn't Ashford standing in my doorway with a business card I can refuse to be scared of. This is a number on a government form, and numbers like that don't care how many neighbors show up with garden hoses. No, he agreed quietly. But numbers like that can sometimes be appealed, challenged. My cousin went through something similar 2 towns over, a few years back. Assessment jump tied to a development rumor that never actually materialized. Took him about 4 months and a lawyer willing to work on a payment plan, but the county eventually knocked the number back down once they had to actually defend the reassessment in front of a review board instead of just mailing it out and hoping nobody pushed back. A lawyer, Aline repeated. That costs money too, Rodolfo. Everything about fighting this costs money I don't have, which is sort of the whole point of how this particular trap works. It was Dulce who arrived next, alerted by the same postmaster-fueled grapevine, clipboard already in hand out of what Aline was starting to recognize as pure organizational reflex, though her expression carried none of the brisk efficiency it usually did. "I called my sister the second I heard," she said without preamble. "The one at the county planning office. She says you're not alone in this, Aline. Half a dozen other properties along the corridor got the same reassessment notice this week. The co-op, the Whitfield place, even the church hall got hit, though churches usually carry some exemption that'll probably soften their sum." She set the clipboard down on the counter, and for once it held nothing written on it at all, just a blank page waiting to be filled. "This isn't really about you specifically, or even about Ashford specifically anymore. It's the whole corridor getting swept up in one bureaucratic decision that doesn't much care about barns being saved or fires being put out. Which means, in a strange way, this might actually be a fight we can win together, the same way we won the last one. Because it's not just your problem. It's the whole street's problem, all over again." Aline looked around the store, at her mother, jaw set with the particular determination that Aline was only now understanding must have been passed down rather than skipped a generation, at Rodolfo, already turning the problem over with the same patient focus he brought to a stripped wire or a burnt-out panel, at Dulce, clipboard ready to fill with names and numbers and a plan, because that was simply what Dulce did whenever the ground started shifting, and felt something steady beneath the fear, some structural certainty that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, before a stranger walked in soaked from the rain and a whole town remembered, one crisis at a time, what it meant to actually belong to each other. 90 days, she said slowly, testing the number now instead of flinching from it. That's time enough for a review board hearing if we move fast. Time enough to gather whatever proof we can that this valuation's built on inquiries and rumors instead of anything real. Time enough, maybe, for the whole corridor to show up together instead of each of us fighting our own separate letter alone. "That's the spirit I was hoping to hear," Dulce said, already uncapping her pen. The next several weeks blurred into a different kind of urgency than the fire had been, quieter, slower burning, fought in the unglamorous currency of paperwork and phone calls and evening meetings at the church hall where neighbors compared reassessment notices and pooled whatever money they could spare toward a single lawyer willing to represent the whole corridor as a group rather than 6 separate exhausted families fighting 6 separate exhausting battles. Rodolfo's cousin, contacted and consulted, offered his own lawyer's name and, more valuable still, a rough map of exactly which documents the review board would want to see, which arguments tended to land, which appeals had succeeded elsewhere under similar circumstances. Aline's grandfather's old ledgers, the ones she'd been sorting through the week the notebook surfaced, turned out to hold their own quiet value in the fight. 30 years of documented, steady, unspectacular business, proof that the store's actual worth had never once been tied to speculation about highways that didn't exist. Proof that could be laid out plainly in front of a review board as evidence of what the property had genuinely earned versus what a stranger's inquiry had merely implied. It might someday be worth. It was on the evening before the review board hearing, the whole corridor's case finally compiled into 3 thick binders sitting on the counter like a small fortress of paperwork, that Aline found herself alone in the store after closing, running her hand along the same worn groove in the counter her grandfather's elbow had carved decades before her mother had ever touched it, the candle by the door burned down to its last inch, the neon sign holding steady in the window without a single flicker. She didn't hear Rodolfo come in until he was already beside her, and when she turned, she found him not looking at the binders, not looking at the counter or the ledgers or any of the evidence they'd need tomorrow, just looking at her, steady, the way he'd been looking at her more and more since the night with the velvet box, like he was memorizing something he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I need you to know something before we walk into that room. Rodolfo, if this is about the ring again, I told you." "It's not about the ring," he said, though something in his expression suggested it wasn't entirely not about the ring either. "It's about this." He gestured at the store around them, the shelves, the counter, the candle, the whole small, stubborn, 30-year history of a family's promise to a town. "Whatever the board decides tomorrow, win or lose, I want you to know that watching you fight for this place these past weeks has been the thing that finally taught me what staying somewhere is actually supposed to feel like. Not obligation. Not habit. This specific, difficult, wonderful thing you do every single day, showing up for people who need you to show up. He took her hand, careful, the way he always was with things he'd decided mattered. So tomorrow, whatever that board says about numbers on a page, I need you to remember that the actual value of this place was never something they could ever put a figure on in the first place. It's already been decided, a long time before any of this started, by everyone who's ever walked through that door and stayed. Aline felt tears rise before she could stop them, exhaustion and love and fear all tangled together in a way that had become, over the past month, an increasingly familiar combination. Whatever happens tomorrow, she echoed back to him, I'm glad it's you standing here saying that. I don't think I could have made it this far with anyone else. Outside, the sign buzzed its steady red light against the dark, and somewhere down the corridor, in 5 other homes and storefronts belonging to 5 other families who'd once been strangers to each other's struggles and were now bound together by a shared fight none of them had asked for, similar quiet, hopeful conversations were happening in kitchens and back rooms, everyone bracing themselves for a morning that would decide, in one way or another, whether the town they'd all fought so hard to keep intact would still belong to the people who actually loved it. The county courthouse smelled like old varnish and cold coffee, and the review board's hearing room was nowhere near big enough for everyone who showed up that morning. Folding chairs borrowed from the church hall lining the back wall, people standing in the hallway craning to hear through the propped open door, a whole corridor's worth of families who'd once fought their separate small fights alone now filling a government room shoulder to shoulder, the way Aileen's grandfather always used to. Say a town was supposed to show up for itself. The board sat behind a long table at the front, 3 members, unhurried and unreadable, the same particular blankness Aline remembered from Daniel Ashford's face the first night he'd walked through her door, the practiced neutrality of people whose job it was to look at numbers rather than lives. Their lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Marisol Cortez who Rodolfo's cousin had vouched for personally, laid out the case with the same patient thoroughness Rodolfo brought to a stripped wire, the absence of any file development project, the 30 years of steady, unremarkable ledgers Aileen's grandfather had kept, the timeline showing the reassessment had followed directly on the heels of an inquiry that had never once become anything real. The valuation, Marisol said, standing before the board with the 3 thick binders open on the table, was based entirely on speculative interest that produced no filed permits, no approved projects, and, as of this month, an arson conviction connected to an unrelated attempt to manufacture exactly this kind of panic. We're asking the board to recognize the difference between land that has genuinely appreciated and land that was simply, briefly, rumored to be about to. The board deliberated behind closed doors for 40 minutes that felt, to Aline, sitting between her mother and Rodolfo in the front row, like 40 separate years. Miss Adalgisa sat 2 seats down, cane planted firmly between her feet, refusing on principle to look nervous even though her knuckles had gone white around the handle. Frank Reyes stood near the door with his arms crossed, having driven 3 of his cousins in from the far side of the county specifically to fill seats and, as he put it, remind these people how many of us there actually are. When the board filed back in, the head member, a tired-looking man named Grierson who Aline recognized vaguely from some long-ago town council meeting, cleared his throat and read from a prepared statement in a voice that gave nothing away until the very end of it. The board finds the reassessment was issued prematurely, based on inquiry stage interest rather than documented development activity, he read, and rules that the corridor's properties be returned to their prior valuation, pending any future reassessment tied to actual, filed, approved projects rather than speculative inquiry. The room didn't erupt so much as exhale, all at once, a collective release of breath that had been held, in one form or another, for the better part of 2 months. Aline felt her mother's arm come around her before she'd even fully processed the words, felt Rodolfo's hand find hers under the table, and for a long moment she simply sat there, letting the relief move through her the way the fire's smoke had moved through the air that terrible night, thick, disorienting, and finally, mercifully, clearing. Outside on the courthouse steps, the whole corridor's worth of neighbors gathered in the bright autumn sun, And what began as scattered congratulations slowly, inevitably, turned into something closer to a celebration. Frank Reyes producing a cooler of sodas from his truck like he'd been planning for this outcome the whole time, Dulce already talking about organizing another Saturday work party, this one simply for the joy of it rather than the necessity, Miss Adalgisa accepting. Congratulations with the regal bearing of a woman who had, in her own words, seen this town through worse and never once doubted it. It was 2 weeks later, on a golden October evening with the store's shelves freshly restocked and the whole street looking, for the first time in longer than Aline could remember, entirely, uncomplicatedly at peace, that Rodolfo asked her to walk with him after closing. Nothing unusual in that, they'd taken to walking the length of Main Street together most evenings since the hearing, tracing the wiring he'd fixed building by building like a man checking on old friends. But this evening he stopped her in front of the store itself, under the neon sign glowing steady red against the darkening sky, the little candle by the door visible through the window behind them, still burning the way it had every single morning and evening since her grandfather first lit it decades before. "I want to tell you something," he said, "before I ask you something. So you understand exactly what you're saying yes to, if you say it." "Rodolfo, let me finish. Please." He took a breath, and for the first time in months, Aline saw something like nervousness cross his face, the same uncertain expression he'd worn that very first night, dripping in her doorway, not knowing where to put his hands. "I spent 12 years believing the safest way to move through the world was never letting anywhere hold me. Never staying long enough for a place to matter, because places that matter can burn, or flood, or get bought out from under you, and I told myself I was protecting something by staying loose, staying ready to leave before any of that could touch me." He gestured at the street around them, the fresh wiring, the steady lights in every window, the whole quiet, hard-won piece of an evening with nothing left to survive. "And then I walked through that door soaked from a storm, and met a woman who taught me, without ever meaning to, that the actual safest thing a person can do is find something worth the risk of losing, and fight for it anyway. That the fear of a thing burning down isn't a good enough reason not to build it in the first place." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the small velvet box, and this time, when he opened it, his hands were steady. "I'm not asking you to leave this place, Aline. I'm asking to stay in it with you, permanently in every sense of the word. Not because I've finally decided the risk is small enough to be safe, but because I've finally understood that some things are worth staying for precisely because the risk is real. This town. This store. I want to spend the rest of my life being the man who shows up, every evening at the same hour, for the same reason, until showing up isn't a choice anymore, just simply who I am." He knelt, right there on the worn wooden step where he'd first stood dripping and uncertain, and held the ring up between them. "Aline Miller, will you marry me?" Aline heard, faintly, through the open door behind her, the sound of her mother's sharp intake of breath, and beyond that, unmistakably, Miss Adalgisa's voice carrying from somewhere down the street. Well, finally, took him long enough, followed by what sounded suspiciously like half the neighborhood gathering at a discreet but entirely unsubtle distance, drawn by whatever grapevine had apparently informed the entire corridor of exactly what evening this was going to be. "Yes," Aline said, laughing through tears that had arrived faster than she could stop them, pulling him up to standing before he'd even finished sliding the ring onto her finger. "Yes, Rodolfo, of course, yes." The street erupted into the kind of noise a town only makes once or twice in a generation. Frank Reyes whooping from his porch, Dulce already crying into her husband's shoulder, old man Whitfield banging his cane against his own porch rail in what could generously be called applause, and Miss Adalgisa making her slow, triumphant way up the street declaring to anyone who'd listened that she'd known it the very first week. Hadn't she said so? Hadn't she told the girl plain as day that a man doesn't drive 2 miles out of his way every evening for a soda he could buy at the gas station? Above them, the neon sign burned steady and unbroken, red against the deepening dark, the way it had every night since the fire, since the hearing, since the whole long fight that had somehow, improbably, delivered them here. And beside it, through the window, the small candle continued its quiet vigil by the door, lit that morning as it would be lit every morning after, not to call anyone in, not anymore, but simply to mark, faithfully and without fail, that someone was here, that someone would always be here, ready for whoever walked through next. Years later, when people driving the corridor asked why a small, unremarkable corner store on an unremarkable stretch of highway seemed to matter so much to the town around it, the answer they'd get, from whoever happened to be behind the counter that day, was always some version of the same story, of a stranger who walked in soaked from a storm, of a sentence spoken before it could be caught, of a whole town that chose, again and again, not to be afraid. And every morning, before the first customer ever crossed the threshold, the candle was lit, and the sign was switched on, steady now, never flickering, because some things, once fixed properly and fought for honestly, simply stayed fixed. A promise a family made to a town, and a town made back, kept faithfully, the way promises like that are always meant to be kept. The board sat behind a long table at the front, 3 members, unhurried and unreadable, the same particular blankness Aline remembered from Daniel Ashford's face the first night he'd walked through her door, the practiced neutrality of people whose job it was to look at numbers rather than lives. Their lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Marisol Cordes who Rodolfo's cousin had vouched for personally, laid out the case with the same patient thoroughness Rodolfo brought to a stripped wire, the absence of any filed development project, the 30 years of steady, unremarkable ledgers Aline's grandfather had kept. The timeline showing the reassessment had followed directly on the heels of an inquiry that had never once become anything real. The valuation, Marisol said, standing before the board with the 3 thick binders open on the table, was based entirely on speculative interest that produced no filed permits, no approved projects, and, as of this month, an arson conviction connected to an unrelated attempt to manufacture exactly this kind of panic. We're asking the board to recognize the difference between land that has genuinely appreciated and land that was simply, briefly, rumored to be about to. The board deliberated behind closed doors for 40 minutes that felt, to Aline, sitting between her mother and Rodolfo in the front row, like 40 separate years. Miss Adalgisa sat 2 seats down, cane planted firmly between her feet, refusing on principle to look nervous even though her knuckles had gone white around the handle. Frank Reyes stood near the door with his arms crossed, having driven 3 of his cousins in from the far side of the county specifically to fill seats and, as he put it, remind these people how many of us there actually are. When the board filed back in, the head member, a tired-looking man named Grierson who Aline recognized vaguely from some long-ago town council meeting, cleared his throat and read from a prepared statement in a voice that gave nothing away until the very end of it. The board finds the reassessment was issued prematurely, based on inquiry stage interest rather than documented development activity, he read, and rules that the corridor's properties be returned to their prior valuation, pending any future reassessment tied to actual, filed, approved projects rather than speculative inquiry. The room didn't erupt so much as exhale, all at once, a collective release of breath that had been held, in one form or another, for the better part of 2 months. Aline felt her mother's arm come around her before she'd even fully processed the words, felt Rodolfo's hand find hers under the table, and for a long moment she simply sat there, letting the relief move through her the way the fire's smoke had moved through the air that terrible night, thick, disorienting, and finally, mercifully, clearing. Outside on the courthouse steps, the whole corridor's worth of neighbors gathered in the bright autumn sun, and what began as scattered congratulations slowly, inevitably, turned into something closer to a celebration. Frank Reyes producing a cooler of sodas from his truck like he'd been planning for this outcome the whole time, Dulce already talking about organizing another Saturday work party, this one simply for the joy of it rather than the necessity, Miss Adalgisa accepting. Congratulations with the regal bearing of a woman who had, in her own words, seen this town through worse and never once doubted it. It was 2 weeks later, on a golden October evening with the store's shelves freshly restocked and the whole street looking, for the first time in longer than Aline could remember, entirely, uncomplicatedly at peace, that Rodolfo asked her to walk with him after closing. Nothing unusual in that, they'd taken to walking the length of Main Street together most evenings since the hearing, tracing the wiring he'd fixed building by building like a man checking on old friends. But this evening he stopped her in front of the store itself, under the neon sign glowing steady red against the darkening sky, the little candle by the door visible through the window behind them, still burning the way it had every single morning and evening since her grandfather first lit it decades before. "I want to tell you something," he said, "before I ask you something. So you understand exactly what you're saying yes to, if you say it." "Rodolfo, let me finish. Please." He took a breath, and for the first time in months, Aline saw something like nervousness cross his face, the same uncertain expression he'd worn that very first night, dripping in her doorway, not knowing where to put his hands. "I spent 12 years believing the safest way to move through the world was never letting anywhere hold me. Never staying long enough for a place to matter, because places that matter can burn, or flood, or get bought out from under you, and I told myself I was protecting something by staying loose, staying ready to leave before any of that could touch me." He gestured at the street around them, the fresh wiring, the steady lights in every window, the whole quiet, hard-won piece of an evening with nothing left to survive. "And then I walked through that door soaked from a storm, and met a woman who taught me, without ever meaning to, that the actual safest thing a person can do is find something worth the risk of losing, and fight for it anyway. That the fear of a thing burning down isn't a good enough reason not to build it in the first place." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the small velvet box, and this time, when he opened it, his hands were steady. "I'm not asking you to leave this place, Aline. I'm asking to stay in it with you, permanently in every sense of the word. Not because I've finally decided the risk is small enough to be safe, but because I've finally understood that some things are worth staying for precisely because the risk is real. This town. This store. I want to spend the rest of my life being the man who shows up, every evening at the same hour, for the same reason, until showing up isn't a choice anymore, just simply who I am." He knelt, right there on the worn wooden step where he'd first stood dripping and uncertain, and held the ring up between them. "Aline Miller, will you marry me?" Aline heard, faintly, through the open door behind her, the sound of her mother's sharp intake of breath, and beyond that, unmistakably, Miss Adalgise's voice carrying from somewhere down the street. Well, finally, took him long enough, followed by what sounded suspiciously like half the neighborhood gathering at a discreet but entirely unsubtle distance, drawn by whatever grapevine had apparently informed the entire corridor of exactly what evening this was going to be. "Yes," Aline said, laughing through tears that had arrived faster than she could stop them, pulling him up to standing before he'd even finished sliding the ring onto her finger. "Yes, Rodolfo, of course, yes." The street erupted into the kind of noise a town only makes once or twice in a generation. Frank Reyes whooping from his porch, Dulce already crying into her husband's shoulder, old man Whitfield banging his cane against his own porch rail in what could generously be called applause, and Miss Adalgisa making her slow, triumphant way up the street declaring to anyone who'd listened that she'd known it the very first week. Hadn't she said so? Hadn't she told the girl plain as day that a man doesn't drive 2 miles out of his way every evening for a soda he could buy at the gas station? Above them, the neon sign burned steady and unbroken, red against the deepening dark, the way it had every night since the fire, since the hearing, since the whole long fight that had somehow, improbably, delivered them here. And beside it, through the window, the small candle continued its quiet vigil by the door, lit that morning as it would be lit every morning after, not to call anyone in, not anymore, but simply to mark, faithfully and without fail, that someone was here, that someone would always be here, ready for whoever walked through next. Years later, when people driving the corridor asked why a small, unremarkable corner store on an unremarkable stretch of highway seemed to matter so much to the town around it, the answer they'd get, from whoever happened to be behind the counter that day, was always some version of the same story, of a stranger who walked in soaked from a storm, of a sentence spoken before it could be caught, of a whole town that chose, again and again, not to be afraid. And every morning, before the first customer ever crossed the threshold, the candle was lit, and the sign was switched on, steady now, never flickering, because some things, once fixed properly and fought for honestly, simply stayed fixed. A promise a family made to a town, and a town made back, kept faithfully, the way promises like that are always meant to be kept.